The scent of sizzling meat fills the air. The women, hungry and wary, peer over a barbed wire fence, unsure whether to believe their eyes. The rough-hewn men in cowboy hats, hands calloused from ranch work, stand around a smoky fire, laughing, drinking, and cooking what looks like food. Real food. One of the German POWs, a young woman with hollow cheeks and the look of someone who has seen too much, takes a hesitant step forward. The last time she had seen a meal like this was before the war, when her family gathered for Sunday roasts. Her heart beats faster, a confusing mix of hunger, disbelief, and fear. These were the enemy, the Americans who had been painted as monsters in her mind since childhood. Yet here they were, offering her a plate of barbecued meat like an old friend. She hesitates, bracing for an insult, a trick. But the laughter continues, warm and inviting. She takes a step closer. What now? The tension between loyalty to their country and the kindness shown by their captors began to create a moral conflict. They remembered their families back home, suffering, starving, and still at war, while they were fed and treated with dignity. Some of the women began to open up to each other, sharing their fears, doubts, and growing discomfort with the propaganda they had been fed. The journey to the American camp had felt like an eternity. The clattering of train wheels, the uncertain stops in dark, desolate stations, and the long stretches of silent fear made the women feel as if the war would never end. They had been told countless stories of American cruelty, how the enemy would break them, humiliate them, and tear them apart. They had braced themselves for violence, for punishment, and for suffering beyond what they had already endured. Yet, as the train screeched to a halt and the doors opened to the bright, cool morning air, something unexpected happened. The soldiers waiting for them were not snarling monsters. They were just men, tired, detached, and professional. The women were herded off the train in small groups, scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. The fences, the barbed wire, and the guard towers were exactly as they had imagined. But the soldiers felt different. There was no anger in their voices, no sneers or threats. They spoke quietly, with efficient order. Some women were still filled with terror, clutching their meager belongings, but the realization that they were not immediately brutalized made them question everything. One woman, Anna, barely 22 and worn thin by months of retreat, couldn't stop her eyes from wandering. The barracks were simple but clean, and the camp had a strange calmness to it. The women were given time to settle in before their first meal. The mess hall was a long wooden structure, sunlight spilling through large windows onto tables lined with trays. The smell of something warm and comforting filled the air. Anna had expected to be herded, starved, or even beaten for the slightest infraction. But instead, she found herself standing in front of a tray of steaming stew. It was simple, just potatoes, beans, and meat, but it was warm and plentiful. There were no jeers, no mockery. The soldiers, who were supposed to be their captors, were quietly eating beside them. Anna hesitated before sitting down. She glanced at the other women, some already hungrily devouring the food, while others, like herself, were slow to move. Could they trust this meal? She had been taught to believe the Americans would never show them kindness. It didn't make sense. These men, the enemy, had been painted as monsters. She had been taught from childhood that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, and that falling into American hands would mean the end of everything they had fought for. The words of her officers echoed in her mind. Better to die than be taken by the Americans. And yet here they were, sitting at a table, offered warmth and food. The contradiction twisted within her. Anna finally took a tentative spoonful of stew, feeling the warmth spread through her hands. The taste was rich, far beyond anything she had eaten in months. It was real food, meat, potatoes that weren't mush. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes. She could barely remember the last time she had tasted something so simple, so human. As the other women saw her reaction, some began to follow suit, eating slowly, cautiously. The act of eating felt like an impossible dream. As they ate, confusion flooded their minds. This was not what they had been taught. The Americans weren't the monsters they had been warned about. They didn't mock them, didn't treat them as tools. Instead, they offered kindness, respect, humanity, decency. The psychological blow was too sharp for the women to fully process. They questioned everything they had believed about the world. Liesel, sitting quietly, reflected on the soldiers around her. They weren't the faceless, nameless enemies she had been taught to hate. They were just people, struggling to survive in the same war that had ravaged them all. The more she watched, the more she realized they weren't forcing kindness on her. They were simply offering it. It was disorienting and unsettling, but it was also deeply human. As the meal ended, the women leaned back, filled not just with food, but with an unsettling sense of possibility. Could it be that they had been wrong about everything? That the enemy, whom they had been taught to fear, might not be as monstrous as they had believed? The realization lingered in the air, a question they didn't yet know how to answer. The women lay in their beds, the hard mattresses beneath them a stark contrast to the straw mats they had slept on in their last days in Germany. Sleep came slowly. They were consumed by a question that had begun to take root. If these Americans were capable of this, then what else had been a lie? The next evening, the air in the camp shifted. As the women settled in after another monotonous day, they heard something from across the camp. Laughter, genuine and unforced, drifting toward them from beyond the barracks. It was a sound they hadn't expected in a place like this. The laughter, full of warmth, felt out of place, almost wrong, but unmistakable. It was punctuated by the smell of something sizzling on an open flame. Meat. Real meat. The scent filled their senses, sharp and comforting. The hunger that had been gnawing at them for weeks suddenly became sharper, more desperate. Could it be? Could the enemy, painted as the worst kind of monster, actually be cooking a meal for them? Without thinking, they found themselves moving toward the smell, their feet drawn by an invisible force. The guards, stationed near the fire, didn't stop them. They stood watch with rifles, but there was no aggression in their posture, no shouting, no threats. Instead, the soldiers quietly tended the fire, turning pieces of meat on the grill, occasionally exchanging casual words in a relaxed cadence. The women, minds still tangled with suspicion, moved slowly, unsure of what to expect. Each step toward the fire felt like a leap into an unknown world. Liesel, a nurse just 22, hesitated more than the others. She was the most cautious, the most reluctant to believe what was happening. She had heard the stories. The Americans were heartless, ruthless conquerors. But now, here they were, grilling meat as if they were hosting a picnic. There was no mockery, no cruelty, only a soft, almost apologetic invitation to step forward and join them. The soldiers seemed more confused than malicious, as though uncertain about the situation they found themselves in. The women, prepared for the worst, stood frozen in place. The invitation was clear. Come closer, take a plate, eat. But it felt wrong. Could they trust this? Could they accept food from the very men who had been painted as demons? Some murmured to each other, exchanging uncertain glances. What if it was poisoned? What if it was a test? Their hunger clawed at them, but fear held them in place. One soldier, sensing their hesitation, smiled faintly. His face was tired, worn, but his eyes flickered briefly toward the women, then back to the grill. The fire crackled in the stillness, and the smell of meat filled the evening air. Finally, one of the older women, a former schoolteacher, stepped forward. Her hands trembled at her sides, but with a deep breath, she accepted the plate from the soldier. "It's just food," he said, his voice low and neutral. "No cruelty, no mockery, just a simple offering." Liesel watched as the older woman took the plate, her hands shaking as she accepted the food. She saw the hesitation in her face soften as the warmth of the meat filled her mouth. Seeing this, the other women followed her lead. The food wasn't poisoned. It was warm and rich, with the seasoning they hadn't tasted in months. The hunger in their bones was replaced by a strange sense of comfort, and the warmth spread through them, chasing away the cold of fear and deprivation. Even as they savored the meal, confusion flooded their minds. This was not what they had been taught. The Americans weren't the monsters they had been warned about. They didn't mock them, didn't treat them as cattle. They treated them with respect, humanity, decency. It was a blow to everything they had believed about the world. Liesel sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames on her skin, the meat almost too much to bear. She had been prepared for suffering, for brutality, but instead she found herself surrounded by soldiers who didn't hate her, who saw her as a person. Her mind raced, battling the dissonance between what she had been taught and the reality before her. Could kindness truly exist in a place like this? For a moment, the fire held them in fragile peace. The soldiers' laughter grew louder, and the women, once so determined to hold on to their beliefs, began to laugh quietly as well. It wasn't a laughter of joy, but of disbelief. In that fleeting moment, it felt like something more, perhaps the first crack in the walls they had built around their hearts. The laughter from the soldiers grew louder, and the women, once so determined to hold on to their beliefs, began to laugh quietly as well. It was not laughter born of joy, but of disbelief, a recognition of a world they hadn't known existed. The warmth of the fire, the scent of food, and the sound of laughter were simple acts of humanity, stark against the backdrop of the war they had left behind. In that fleeting moment, it felt like something more, the first crack in the walls they had built around their hearts. As they settled down to eat, the weight of their doubts lingered. The women's hands shook as they lifted their forks, unsure whether to trust the food. Could this really be happening? Hadn't they been warned about the horrors of American captivity? The meat, warm, tender, rich with flavor, seemed almost too perfect to believe. Some couldn't help but wonder if it was poisoned, a trick to break them psychologically. The shock of the kindness they were receiving deepened, tangled with the taste of the food in ways they hadn't expected. Anna, who had hesitated the most, took a deep breath and pushed aside her reservations. She watched as another woman took a bite, her face softening as the food filled her mouth. The silence around the fire felt thick, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Finally, the woman beside Anna spoke, her voice thick with disbelief. "It's good," she murmured, testing the words. "It's real." And then, as if the first bite had broken some spell, the others began to follow suit. The food wasn't poisoned. It was warm, rich, and filled with the kind of seasoning they hadn't tasted in months. The meat filled their hunger. The soft bread they could tear apart without hesitation. The warmth from their stomachs chased away the chill of months of fear and deprivation. Liesel, sitting quietly, felt the first stirrings of doubt. She had been prepared for death, ready to endure anything, even at the hands of her captors, but she wasn't prepared for this. this human act that tore down the walls of fear she had carried for so long. She thought of the things she had been taught about the enemy. The Americans were monsters, barbarians who would crush their spirits. And yet, here they were, offering food, offering respect. How could this be? As the fire crackled, Liesel looked at the soldiers in a new light. They were not faceless enemies. They were men and women trying to survive in the aftermath of a war that had ravaged them all. They weren't monsters. They were human beings offering what little they had. The more she watched, the more she realized they weren't forcing their kindness on her. They weren't demanding gratitude or loyalty. They were simply offering, and that was what made it so disorienting. It wasn't the food itself. It was the gesture, the decency in a place where she had expected none. Some of the soldiers exchanged glances, one smiling faintly, not in mockery, but in quiet understanding. It was a shift, the first of many, that would ripple through the camp. As the evening wore on, the warmth of the fire began to feel like something more than comfort. It became a connection, an unspoken understanding that had begun to bridge the gap between them. They were no longer enemies. They were simply people, sharing a meal in a world torn apart by war. The belief that they were enemies by virtue of nationality, that kindness was a weapon to break them, began to crumble. In its place was something new, the realization that perhaps they weren't so different after all. Some of the women laughed softly, exchanging stories of their families, their lives before the war. The soldiers did the same. The simple act of sharing stories began to dissolve the barriers between them. They were all human, and for the first time in a long while, the women began to question everything they had been taught. Could it be that the enemy, whom they had been taught to fear, might not be as monstrous as they had believed? As the fire burned low and the soldiers packed up their things, the night felt different. Something profound had shifted, something they couldn't yet fully understand. They had started to ask the most dangerous question of all. What if the world they had been fighting for wasn't worth fighting for at all? The days that followed were filled with a quiet tension. The fire, the food, and the soldiers' respectful treatment lingered in the women's minds like an itch they couldn't scratch. They had once been so sure of the righteousness of their cause, convinced they fought for something noble. But now, in the wake of something as simple as a meal, everything seemed uncertain. The kindness they had witnessed began to unsettle them. Could it be they had been wrong? Could the world they had been raised to protect, the world of duty, honor, and loyalty to the Reich, be a lie? Liesel, who had been the most devout, felt the weight of this question pressing on her chest. She had always believed her worth was tied to her role as a soldier, to the honor of fighting for the Reich, for Germany's future. But here, in the camp, she was treated not as a soldier, but as a person. The kindness of the Americans, men who had been demonized in every piece of propaganda, shook that conviction. Could it be that her captors were simply men, capable of mercy, capable of sharing food and warmth with those they had defeated? Her mind refused to accept it, but her heart, warmed by the meal, began to whisper that perhaps the war had no meaning at all. The conflict within her deepened as she lay in her bunk that night, the meal's whispers still fresh in her memory. She thought of her family back in Germany, her mother, frail and starving in the ruins of their home, her brothers, perhaps dead, and the children begging for scraps in the streets. They had fought for their homeland, for a cause they had been told was noble. Yet here she was, sitting at the edge of a world where those ideals were questioned with a simple gesture of kindness. How could she, a soldier of the Reich, betray her family's memory by accepting such kindness? Was it not a betrayal of everything she had believed in? Anna, who had hesitated to embrace this change, found herself asking, "Why do we fight?" Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, as if afraid the question might betray her. The others, startled, didn't know how to answer. The war had always been black and white, victory or defeat, loyalty or betrayal. But in the quiet of the camp, the lines blurred. "I don't know any more," Margaret said softly. "We were told we fought for honor, for our families. But my family is starving. They're being crushed by the war, and here we are, fed, treated with kindness." Her voice trailed off, shaking. "It doesn't make sense." Liesel nodded, her voice tinged with confusion and sorrow. "But what are we really fighting for? Our honor? Our loyalty? To what end? What's left of our honor when our families are dying?" The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered. As the night wore on, the women began to share their doubts, their fears, and their realizations. They began to bond over the kindness they had received from the very people they had been taught to hate. The seeds of doubt had been planted, and they began to grow, nurtured by the unexpected kindness of their captors. The women started to form new alliances, ones not based on nationality or ideology, but on shared humanity. In a place where they had expected cruelty, they had found respect, decency, and kindness. And as they spoke together, they realized that the war, with all its violence and destruction, had begun to feel distant. They were no longer just soldiers, they were human beings searching for meaning in a world torn apart. The days that followed felt both strange and familiar. The camp's harsh routine began to soften, and as the women moved through their days, they became more aware of their own humanity. They had been soldiers, molded by war, taught to sacrifice without question. But now, as they sat in the mess hall eating their meals, something shifted. The food, once feared, symbolized survival, a reminder that their worth wasn't defined by their ability to fight, but by their simple existence. A quiet dignity began to emerge. It wasn't just the food. It was the conversations, the stories exchanged as days passed. The soldiers, too, had stories, tales of homes, wives, and children waiting for them. These stories, shared over steaming bowls of stew, grilled meat, and fresh bread, revealed the soldiers were not faceless enemies, but human beings. For the first time, the women saw them as men, vulnerable, uncertain, human, just like themselves. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the soft strum of a guitar broke the quiet of the camp. The music was tentative at first, as though the player wasn't sure whether the women would approve, but it was an unexpected kindness. The women paused, letting the music wash over them. Some closed their eyes, letting the melody fill the air, while others exchanged uncertain glances. How could the enemy, these Americans, share something so intimate as music with them? How could they offer something so human in a place that was meant to be their prison? The realization came slowly. The soldiers, their captors, were not so different from the women who had once been soldiers in the Reich. They had been shaped by the same war, driven by the same violence, yet here they were, showing warmth, kindness, and humanity. The generosity and respect they had experienced in captivity began to carve deeply into the women's minds. They were no longer merely prisoners. They were individuals, seen, valued, even if only for a brief moment amidst the brutality of war. But as the days passed, the contrast between their newfound humanity and the suffering of their families back home grew unbearable. Their families, mothers, fathers, brothers, were still living in ruins, enduring the horrors of a war that seemed endless. How could they reconcile the kindness they received in captivity with the destruction their families were enduring? How could they sit at a table, share meals, and laugh with their captors, knowing their loved ones were suffering? The women began to speak more openly about the shame they felt. How could they accept the food, the warmth, the music, while their families were starving, dying? Liesel, the most reserved, voiced what many others felt. How can we eat, knowing our families are starving? How can we laugh, knowing they are dying? The question hung in the air, unanswered. There was no easy way to reconcile the reality of captivity with the harsh truth outside the barbed wire. Yet, even as guilt weighed on them, something began to shift within the women. They started to understand that humanity wasn't defined by nationality or political allegiance. It wasn't about uniforms or flags. It was about actions. The simple act of sharing a meal, offering music, treating someone with kindness. Those were the things that truly defined humanity. This realization changed their perspective. The soldiers, once seen as enemies, were now fellow human beings, raised in the same world of suffering and destruction, but choosing, in this moment, to act with decency. The women began talking more openly with the soldiers, asking questions, sharing stories, and finding common ground in their shared humanity. The transformation was subtle, but profound. The war, once so clear in its divisions, began to blur. The women understood that sometimes the enemy could be the ones who showed the most humanity. As they sat around the campfire, music still playing softly in the background, they realized that despite everything, they had found something worth holding on to, a glimpse of what it meant to be truly human. But that realization, while profound, was not without its complications. As the days wore on, the women began to feel the weight of the divide between the world they had known and the reality they now faced. Raised to believe loyalty to the Reich was paramount, they had been taught that honor could only be proven through sacrifice and suffering. Yet, in the quiet of the American camp, everything they had been taught seemed to unravel. The Americans, whom they had been conditioned to despise, were showing them unexpected acts of kindness, shared laughter, and even work assignments given freely rather than as punishment. They were treated as human beings, not as enemies, and this created a painful rift in their understanding of the world. One evening, Liesel sat with the other women in the mess hall, watching the soldiers. They sat at long tables, laughing and talking like old friends. The laughter wasn't cruel or mocking. It was warm, genuine, as if they had momentarily forgotten the war that had torn their lives apart. The women watched from across the room, uncertain of how to react. Some, like Liesel, clung to the belief that the Americans were enemies, their captors. But as the evening wore on, and the laughter continued to fill the air, something began to shift within them. How could they be enemies with people who shared food with them, who told stories without anger or malice? How could they hate people who treated them with respect, who didn't see them as objects, but as individuals? The divide between their old world view and the new reality grew wider with each passing day. The kindness of the Americans, so simple, so human, began to feel like a betrayal of everything they had believed in. They had been taught to see the Americans as less than human, as an enemy to be crushed. But here they were, treating them better than they had ever been treated by their own comrades. In the midst of this confusion, some of the women began reaching out to their families. Letters from home had been infrequent, and they had been cautious about what they wrote, wary of betraying their country. But now, with the mixture of gratitude and shame swirling inside them, they began to write more openly, though cautiously. They described the food, the warmth of the barracks, the kindness of the soldiers, but they did so with fear, unsure how their families would react to their newfound perceptions of the enemy. Would they be seen as traitors? Liesel hesitated over her letter. She had written about the food, the music, the warmth of the camp, but she couldn't bring herself to write about the soldiers' kindness. How could she explain that the enemy had shown her more humanity than her own country had? The words felt dangerous, as if writing them would be the final step toward losing herself, toward betraying everything she had believed in. She sealed the letter, unsure whether it was enough to explain what she was feeling. The internal conflict was too great, the tension between gratitude and shame too deep. As the days wore on, the cultural divide remained. They were caught between the world of propaganda and the new world of unexpected kindness, unable to reconcile the two. Yet, in their hearts, something was changing. They began to realize that humanity was not defined by nationality or borders. It was defined by the actions of individuals, and as they shared meals and stories with the soldiers, they understood the enemy they had been taught to hate was, in fact, as human as they were. In the end, it wasn't the war that broke their world view. It was the unexpected kindness of their captors, and in that realization, they were forced to confront the question that had haunted them from the start. What did it really mean to be human? The weeks that followed felt like a slow, silent unraveling. The once clear lines between soldier and civilian, enemy and ally, began to blur. At first, the women clung to their identities as soldiers of the Reich, conditioned to believe in the righteousness of their cause. But as they spent more time in the camp, sharing meals and stories with their captors, they were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. They were no longer just soldiers. They were individuals, experiencing kindness from the very people they had been taught to hate. The BBQ, the food, the shared laughter, and the warmth of the fire began to feel like a metaphor for the internal transformation they were undergoing. Liesel, the most steadfast in her beliefs, struggled with this shift. She had been raised to believe her worth was tied to her role as a soldier, to the honor of fighting for the Reich. But now, in the camp, she was being treated not as a soldier, but as a person. She had never been seen this way before. The unexpected kindness from the soldiers challenged everything she had known. How could she reconcile this new self, the woman who had tasted the warmth of humanity, with the soldier she had once been? Was she betraying her comrades by accepting kindness from those she had been taught to hate? Liesel wasn't alone in this struggle. The emotional toll was felt by all of the women. The longer they stayed in the camp, the harder it became to reconcile the person they had been with the person they were becoming. Some resisted the change, clinging to the belief that their treatment in the camp was a trap, that the Americans were manipulating their minds. They held on to the image of their captors as monsters, refusing to see them as anything more. But even they couldn't deny the humanity they saw in the soldiers. How could they? The soldiers were kind, respectful, and human. The walls around their identities began to crumble. For those who had embraced this new reality, the transformation was equally profound. They were no longer just POWs. They were individuals with names, faces, and histories. Stripped of their uniforms and roles as soldiers, they were forced to see themselves as more than tools of war. But with this realization came guilt. How could they face their families, their comrades, when they had begun to see the enemy as human? How could they explain the kindness they had received without feeling like traitors? They had been taught that survival meant following orders, obeying commands, never questioning the mission. But in the camp, they learned survival was about more than just food. It was about dignity, respect, and understanding. The deeper realization began to settle. Survival was not simply about staying alive. It was about holding on to one's humanity, maintaining dignity in the face of war's horrors. The kindness they received in captivity had shown them that survival wasn't about fighting. It was about how you treated others and how you held on to your sense of self. The BBQ wasn't just nourishment for their bodies, but for their spirits. It reminded them that there was more to life than fighting, and that humanity went beyond victory or defeat. The struggle for identity continued to haunt them as they talked more openly about their experiences. They had been soldiers, yes, but they were also women who had been shaped by the same forces that shaped their captors. They began to realize that their identities weren't defined by their uniforms, but by their actions, choices, and humanity. This painful transformation left them vulnerable, but it also offered them the freedom to be human again. And as they shared another meal, they understood that survival was not about victory or defeat. It was about what you held on to in the end. The day came when the women were finally told they would be leaving the camp. It was a day they had both dreaded and hoped for, the end of a strange chapter in their lives. As they packed their few belongings and prepared for the journey back to Germany, the weight of what lay ahead settled heavily on their shoulders. They had survived captivity, but what awaited them in their homeland? They were no longer the women who had left. The world they were returning to had been destroyed, both physically and emotionally. The hardest part was knowing that their return would not be the triumph they had once imagined. Instead, it would be a return to a war-ravaged homeland, a place filled with rubble, grief, and the scars of a war they could never escape. As the women stepped off the transport and into the broken streets of Germany, the contrast between the world they had left behind and the one they had returned to hit them with overwhelming force. The towns were unrecognizable, shattered buildings, piles of debris, and silent streets that once had bustled with life. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and decay. The vibrant, bustling cities they remembered were now empty, consumed by war. The faces they saw were gaunt, hollow, worn down by years of conflict. Still in their American-issued clothes, the women stood out against this backdrop of ruin. They felt like strangers in their own land, displaced in a country that had changed as much as they had. The world they had known was gone, and in its place stood a shattered landscape of loss. They had been transformed by their time in captivity, by the kindness they had received, and by the realization that survival wasn't just about fighting for a cause. It was about dignity, humanity, and respect. But how could they explain this transformation to the people they had left behind? How could they convey the depth of their experience without seeming like traitors to their families and their country? When they were greeted by their families, the reunion was not the joyous occasion they had anticipated. There were tears, yes, but there was also a heavy, unspoken tension. Their families had endured years of hardship, their homes and livelihoods destroyed, and they had fought in a war they believed was just. And now here were these women, alive, fed, and healthy, returning from captivity. The contrast between their experiences in the American camp and the suffering their families had endured was too much for some to bear. They were met with suspicion, confusion, and even resentment. How could these women have survived when so many others hadn't? How could they have accepted kindness from the enemy while their families had been left to starve? Liesel's heart ached as she saw the look in her mother's eyes. Her mother had lived through air raids, lost everything, and now here was Liesel, alive and well-fed, held by the very people who had destroyed their country. The guilt of survival settled heavily on her chest. How could she explain to her mother that she had been treated with more kindness in American captivity than she had ever received at home? How could she reconcile the world she had experienced in the camp with the shattered world her family had endured? The impact of captivity on their identities was profound. They were no longer just soldiers of the Reich. They were individuals who had confronted the humanity of their captors. They had learned survival wasn't just about fighting. It was about dignity, respect, and choices made in the face of hardship. Yet, in the ruins of their homeland, they didn't know where they fit. They had been transformed, but their country had not. The world they had left behind was still consumed by war, and it seemed impossible to reconcile the two. As they stood in the rubble, watching their families struggle to rebuild, they began to understand the full weight of what they had lost. Not just homes, but their place in the world. They had survived the war, but they had also been forever changed, caught between the world they had known and the one they had left behind. The women, scattered across Germany, were haunted by memories of the camp. Their homeland was overwhelmed with rubble and dust, the remnants of a country that had tried to conquer the world and lost everything. Yet, even in the face of this devastation, they couldn't forget the kindness they had been shown. The simple act of sharing food, the respect, the human decency from their captors. These memories lingered, stubborn and unyielding. Despite everything, they had experienced something impossible to reconcile with the war they had fought, the war they had been taught to believe in. It wasn't just survival. It was about dignity, respect, and a new way of seeing the world. Some of the women found it easier to reflect on their time in captivity. They spoke about the BBQ, the warmth, the laughter, and how it had shifted something deep inside them. For these women, captivity had been a kind of crucible, forcing them to confront not just the enemy, but themselves. The American soldiers, once faceless enemies, had shown them a kindness they never expected. And in that kindness, they saw something profoundly human. They learned that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about holding on to one's humanity, even in the darkest of times. For others, the reflection was more painful. The guilt of surviving, of being treated with kindness, while so many of their comrades and families had not, weighed heavily on them. How could they reconcile the joy of the small moments with their captors, those brief moments of shared humanity, with the suffering their families were enduring back home? How could they face their families, knowing they had been treated better by the enemy than by their own people? The internal conflict was too great, the guilt too overwhelming. Some women chose to bury these memories, pushing them aside to focus on rebuilding their lives in Germany. They couldn't afford to look back. They had to move forward to rebuild their broken world. Others, however, couldn't forget. They couldn't forget the humanity shown to them by the American soldiers. They found themselves changed in ways they couldn't explain. The lessons of captivity, the warmth, the respect, the understanding, became a part of them. They began to question everything they had been taught about loyalty, honor, and what it meant to fight for a cause. They had been raised to believe surrender was dishonor, that the enemy was a monster. But now they knew better. They had seen the enemy's humanity, and in doing so, they had seen their own. The world was no longer so black and white. The enemy was not just a faceless other. They were people, with families, with stories, with kindness to give. And that realization changed everything. The impact of the BBQ, that simple moment of shared humanity, stayed with them forever. It was the defining moment of their captivity, forcing them to confront deep truths they had long avoided. They had been trained to fight, to sacrifice, to surrender to the war. But what they had been shown in captivity was a different way of life, one that valued life, dignity, and mutual respect. It was a way of life they hadn't known was possible in the chaos of war. That knowledge, that gift of humanity, would stay with them always. As the months turned into years, the women carried the lessons of captivity with them. Some shared their stories openly with those who would listen, while others kept the memories buried deep inside. But no matter how they chose to process it, the impact was undeniable. They had seen the best and worst of humanity, and in the end, it was the kindness that stayed with them. The BBQ, a moment of shared humanity, remained a symbol of their transformation. The war, for all its destruction, had not stolen their humanity. Instead, it had shown them that even from the enemy, there could be kindness. And in that kindness, they found something that no amount of suffering or propaganda could erase: their shared humanity. The women's journey did not end with the war. Their return to Germany was not a clean break from the past, but the beginning of a new, quieter struggle. The lessons learned in captivity, those moments of shared humanity like the BBQ, stayed with them, shaping how they navigated a world that had been forever changed. The act of sitting around a fire, sharing a meal, and laughing with the very soldiers they had been taught to hate became a turning point in their lives. It was more than a moment of survival. It was a profound realization that kindness and respect could exist even in the darkest of times. The BBQ symbolized a shift, a transformation, a recognition that humanity transcends borders, uniforms, and ideologies. For many of the women, the memory of that meal stayed at the core of who they became. It was not just food that filled their stomachs that night. It was a lesson in the power of kindness. They had been taught that to survive meant to fight, to endure, to crush the enemy. But in that moment, with the laughter of their captors and the warmth of the fire, they understood that survival could also mean compassion, understanding, and dignity. These were lessons that no war, no battle could strip away. It was a new kind of strength, one rooted not in violence, but in the ability to see the humanity in others, even when they were your enemy. Years later, as they rebuilt their lives in the ruins of post-war Germany, the women carried these lessons with them. Some shared their stories openly, speaking of the kindness they had encountered, of the soldiers who had offered them a plate of food when they had expected nothing but suffering. Others kept the memories tucked away, knowing they would never be able to fully explain the depth of their transformation. But whether spoken or unspoken, the impact of their time as POWs was undeniable. They were no longer the same women who had boarded that train to captivity. They were women who had learned that survival wasn't just about fighting. It was about learning to live with compassion, to see the humanity in others, even when the world around them told them not to. The symbolism of the BBQ echoed through their lives, reminding them of the power of kindness in the face of conflict. It was a small, simple act, yet it was powerful enough to reshape everything they had once known. As they shared meals with their families, their quiet acts of reconciliation spoke volumes. They had returned home, yes, but they had also returned changed, carrying within them the knowledge that even in the darkest moments, humanity could still prevail. The war may have taken much from them, but it had also given them a deeper understanding of what it meant to be human. And so, as the women moved forward, they did so with a new perspective. They had survived the war, but more importantly, they had survived with their humanity intact. They had learned that true strength didn't lie in battle, but in the ability to show kindness, to offer respect, and to see the humanity in others, no matter their uniform. If you've enjoyed this story, leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to like the video and hit the subscribe button right below the video. It's easy to find. And be sure to click the notification bell so you won't miss out on more immersive historical stories like this one. Your support helps us keep creating more stories that bring history to life. Thank you.